All right, looks like we have begun. And all right, so here we go. All right, so today's Bible study is going to be on the divorce and remarriage study. We're going to be picking it up. This is going to be part two. The last time that we touched on this, I'm just going to do like just a quick review. I'm not going to take too long on this, just so we can understand where we're headed with this. Okay. Basically, we went over the differences between the word divorce and putting away. We looked at how that the ancient world, people understood divorce and putting away to mean the same exact thing, except that when Moses came with the law, the Torah, he differentiated between putting away and the actual divorce. So to build on that again, there's a specific word for divorce and there's a separate word for putting away. Now, again, in the pagan cultures, they practiced both to mean the same thing, but it was the law of Moses that differentiated between an official divorce and the putting away. So that's a very important detail to remember. So when it comes to the subject matter, there's a lot of confusion out there, a lot of ideas that people have put out with regards to divorce and remarriage. The purpose of the study isn't really just to cover the topic of divorce and remarriage. There's actually more to this, which is what we're going to try to get into tonight. And the Bible study itself is not geared just for the. I want to touch on the practical application of this sort of thing, because obviously people have questions, and so obviously I am not an advocate for dropping your spouse for any reason just because you feel like it. And likewise, I am also not here to tell you that if you have gotten divorced that you're in sin. That's actually not true. There are things that can be sin that lead up to a divorce, but just understand that according to the Bible, that divorce was actually a provision in the Bible. And a lot of the things that we read in the New Testament tend to be misconstrued because of translational issues. All right. As a matter of fact, the passage that we talked about specifically on divorce is the only passage that really explains anything about divorce, which is only like a 4 to 5 verse part of Deuteronomy. It's actually Deuteronomy chapter 24. All right. And that Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, or 1 through 5, those verses specifically address the divorce issue. Now, the position that I'm taking on this subject is not to look at the act of divorce and what all entails about divorce and remarriage and things like that. Even though we're elaborating on this, the purpose is to understand how this applies to us as New Testament Christians. Okay, there's a significant transition that has taken place for us as the body of Christ, that we need to understand this particular thing about divorce and remarriage. And I'd like to just reread the passage of Deuteronomy, and I'll read it to you guys. And this is Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 5. And thank you for that, by the way. Appreciate it. It says, when a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it to her in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, that's the first husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she is defiled. for that is abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. Okay. Well, actually, we'll stop there at verse 4. So there's the words in Hebrew here for divorce is keriathus. And the word for sending her out of the house or putting away are the same words in Hebrew. They're usually translated, it's the word shalach, and it's either translated sending her out of the house or putting away. Okay. Those are the two words in Hebrew, and they have corresponding Greek words as well. So the keriathuth, which is what is specific to the divorce, which is something that is done in writing, okay, that the husband has to write by hand and he has to hand it over to the wife, okay. That is the word keriathuth, and in the Greek equivalent to that is apostasion, okay. When you come to the Hebrew word shalach, which is the word translated sending her out or putting her away, the Greek equivalent of that word is actually apoluo. Okay, it literally means to send away. Now, one of the things that we touched on is how that we look a lot at a lot of these terms, and there's a whole lot of misunderstanding. We touched on, somebody mentioned earlier about marriage not being a sacrament. Okay. So the sacrament of marriage was originally instituted by the Catholic Church in 1545 to 1563, I believe are the years. That was the Council of Trent that basically established the sacrament of marriage. Now, the problem with the concept of the sacrament of marriage was that it basically imposed sin where sin did not exist. So, in other words, the Catholic Church frowns on divorce because since they made it a sacrament, if you divorce, you're in sin. And if if you are divorcing your spouse, therefore you're committing sacrilege. You're basically violating a holy sacrament of the Catholic Church. The problem with that is that the law of Moses that we just read is the one law that actually stipulates that it is not only okay to divorce, but it also stipulates that it's okay for a woman to get remarried. So it is not a sin to get divorced, and it is not a sin to get remarried. Okay. And because of the mixture between the words that we read in the Old Testament versus the transition into the New, it actually has a lot to do with a loss in translation. There are words that have been translated that make no sense to be translated as such. Like, for example, when you get into the New Testament, and we read several verses in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31 through 32, Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 12. Those are the three passages that we read in the Gospels in regards to the subject of divorce. Okay. And in all of those passages, what we read is we actually have a mistranslation in some of these passages. So, for example, Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 to 32, it says, and then I'll read it from the screen. It says, "It has been said that whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say to you that whosoever shall put away his wife, save for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery." So according to the passage that we just read in our English translation, particularly this one here is the King James, it's not the only version that reads it this way. It's actually the ESV. The many of the other versions, actually, there's some verses in some versions of the Bible that actually read it a little different. Like the ASV actually reads it a little bit more precise in the text. But basically, the part where it says, "Whosoever shall put away his wife," okay, the word for put away, that's the word apoluo. Okay. Now, what's significant about this verse is that it says that whosoever shall put away his wife, except for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. All right. Now, I want you to think about what it's saying. Whosoever puts away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. So this is about causing a woman to commit adultery by putting her away, except for the cause of fornication. Okay. So that's one aspect of it. And the other part is where it says, whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. Now, the problem with this translation is that it completely violates the law of Moses, right? This is Jesus talking here in Matthew. And the law of Moses says a woman who has been given a bill of divorcement, and after the husband sends her out of the house with the bill of divorcement in her hand, it says that she is free to marry another. She is free. She is free to marry another man. All right. But according to this verse in verse 32, it says, whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. Well, if she's free to marry another after she's been divorced with her husband, then that means, according to this passage, that the man who's marrying her is committing adultery. Well, that makes no sense. There's no reconciliation there. Well, the reason for that is because of the English translation, where it says, whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. The word for divorced in this passage, particularly here in the latter part of verse 32, is not the word apostasion, which is the word for divorce. It is the word apoluo, which is the word for put away. All right. So when you read it in the correct translation, it should say, whosoever shall marry her that is put away commits adultery. And then that is actually the accurate translation because it corresponds to the law of Moses. Now, the reason for that is this, and I'm just going to make a quick rundown on the differences between apostasion and apoluo in the Greek, and karyathuth and shalach in Hebrew. Okay, this is the main difference. In the word for karyathuth or apostasia, right, the Hebrew and Greek equivalents, those are the words specifically attributed to divorce, and it only applies to divorce. There's never a time in which those words are applied in any other context. It is only for the context of divorce. When you get to the word shalach or the apoluo in Greek, right, for the putting away, that word is specifically applied to other things. It isn't just necessarily the husband sending the wife out of the house. As a matter of fact, when you look at other passages, like for example, if you look in Matthew, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Matthew 14, I think, there's a lot of different passages where it says that Jesus sent the crowds away, right? Well, when you look at the passage, it says that he sent the crowds away. The Greek word that's used in that passage is apoluo. Well, did Jesus divorce the crowds? No, he sent them away, right? So there's a distinction between putting away versus being divorced. And another example of that is in the passages that I mentioned earlier in Matthew, where in specifics, there's in Matthew chapter 19, for example, in verses 3 through 9, there is an exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees. Now, mind you, in Matthew chapter 5, that was the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, he's addressing a broad crowd. He's not speaking to a specific group of people. He is specifically addressing a broad crowd of mixed people. In Matthew chapter 19, the same gospel, Jesus is getting into the same topic, but this time he's getting into a discussion directly with the Pharisees. Okay, and in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9, you see this exchange where it says that the Pharisees came to him, tempting him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Now, I want you to notice that they did not say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? It says that, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any reason? Now, the reason why this question is a significant one is because of the way it's worded. So whenever Jesus talks, like when he's addressing the Pharisees, it says that actually, it says in the very beginning of the verse that the Pharisees came unto him, tempting him. That it should be a glimpse, like you should put like a highlighter right over that part where it says tempting him, because they are trying to catch him in his words. They're trying to basically pin a violation of the law by catching him in his words through the question, but through the use of a question that's a trick question. Because the question that they asked him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? The problem with that question is that it's a yes or no answer. And either it is or it is not. And if Jesus were to give either a yes or a no, he would be completely wrong. And that should give you a little bit of insight into the way Jesus thinks. Because there are some questions it's pointless for you to even bother asking or answering, simply because the question itself is based on wrong assumptions. And in this question here, they're asking him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And what's fascinating about this passage is that Jesus, he goes back to the creation account. He says, this is how Jesus answered, have you not read that which he that made them at the beginning made them male and female? He said, for this cause shall man leave father and mother, and they shall cleave to his wife, and the twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. Wherefore what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Now notice what he's talking about. He goes back to the creation of Adam and Eve. In the context of creation, he says, what God has put together, let no man separate. Remember, they were not asking him about divorce. They were asking him about being put away. All right. And then he says this. Oh, and then after he answers them, they ask him another question. And look at their question is on verse 7. And they say to him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement? That's the first one, and to put her away. You see, both are there. Both of them, both writing a divorcement and putting away. And the same thing happens in Mark chapter 10. If you go with me real quick to Mark chapter 10, and again, I told you I'm breezing real through this just to kind of give everybody a background on what's happening here. In Mark chapter 10, this is another conversation that Jesus is having, but it's a separate conversation. The answers that he gives are similar, but they're not identical. And I want you to notice how Jesus cuts to the chase on this. And it says in verse 2, and the Pharisees came to him and asked him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? Tempting him. And there's that qualifier again. They were trying to trick him. And I want you to notice this time they come to him with a different form of the same kind of question. They said to him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife? They didn't ask him if it was for every cause. They didn't ask anything. They just asked if it was lawful for a man to put away his wife, tempting him. And he answered to him, what did Moses command you? He just says, all right, what did Moses say? He just cuts to the chase. And what he's doing is that he knows that they're trying to trick him. They're trying to catch him in his words, to force him to answer a yes and no question with a yes and no answer that in either case would be wrong. So what he does is he forces them to go back to what the law of Moses says, to literally draw out the Pharisees, basically, force them to reveal their hand. Like if I could use a poker euphemism here, is basically forcing them to show their hand by telling them to, by compelling them to read verbatim what the law of Moses says. What does the law of Moses say? The first time this is, well, why then did Moses? And then on this time when they're talking to him, they don't even bring up Moses. Instead, he just forces them, what does the law of Moses say? And by forcing that to happen, he can then respond correctly, because now they're asking the right question in the context of the old covenant. And let me explain to you why that a yes or no answer is wrong. The first question was, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Well, when in the ancient world, putting away was the same thing, was identical as divorce in all pagan cultures. But when the law of Moses was instituted, God put in a specific difference between, hold on a second, yes. Do we have any credits? No, no. So what happened was the law of Moses differentiated between putting away and an actual divorce. And the reason for that was because that there were, for example, there were unions that would be considered illegitimate. And so a divorce was the dissolution of a legitimate, recognized relationship, the marriage between a man and a woman. But let's say you had first generation cousins that wanted to get married. The law of Moses specifically forbid that. So if the two of them were living together, they could never be officially recognized in a marriage. So therefore, the law would say you need to put them away. By putting away, by separating yourself. Why? Because there is no acknowledgement of an illegitimate relationship. If the relationship was legitimate, it would have been a divorce. But because it's not legitimate, it's put away. So with the moment a man hands over a bill of divorcement to the woman, he is now legally no longer married to her. And by them staying together is illegitimate, because the illegitimacy has now been established for them to stay together as long as he's already given her a bill of divorcement. And so once she is sent out of the house, she by law is free to marry another person. Okay. If Jesus were to answer this question from the Pharisees, and he said to them, if they said, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Then what, if Jesus said yes, then he would be violating the law of Moses, because the law of Moses says that in order for you to put away your wife, you have to first issue a bill of divorcement. Because if you says you can put away your wife for any reason, well, guess what? The law of Moses says, no, you can't. You have to give her a writing of divorcement, right? But if he says it is not lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause, then what the Pharisees could do is that they could accuse him of breaking the law of the Romans, because the Romans practiced putting away as divorce is the same thing. Remember, they're trying to get Jesus out of the picture. They're trying to catch him either in the law of Moses, in the violation of the law of Moses, by saying yes, or in a violation of the law of the Romans to get him arrested by saying no. Jesus doesn't play that game with them. He forces them to draw out the Pharisees so that they can confer to the law, to they can refer to directly to what the law of Moses states. So that way he can answer the question in the correct context, because their question is lacking the context necessary. Does somebody have a question?
Yeah, didn't they did this quite often with Jesus, trying to catch him in his words, where they're trying to compare the law of Moses and the law of the Romans, right? Like, didn't they do that with the woman who was caught committing adultery? They did that with him too, right?
Yeah, so it was the same thing with the woman who committed adultery. The reason for that is because the law of Moses stipulates that you have to stone somebody to death who is caught in the act of adultery, right? However, in the days when Jesus was a toddler, the Romans stripped the Jews of their authority to conduct capital punishment. So they could no longer execute Jesus, or they couldn't execute anybody unless they had Roman authority overseeing and going through a particular judgment, which is precisely why they wanted to bring Jesus before Pilate, because they had lost the ability to conduct capital punishment according to Jewish law. Well, in the context, in the portion about the adulterous woman, for one, they had brought the woman, they didn't ever brought the man, so they were supposed to have done this. Both the man and the woman were supposed to be brought together. They had already broken the law in that sense. And then when they brought her to Jesus, they knew that if Jesus, they asked him the law of Moses, the question that they had. And if you guys want to, if you can put into the Blue Letter Bible, I just want to kind of just to answer the question, put into the Blue Letter Bible there, write down the adulterous woman, just so they have it in front of them. But basically, the Pharisees came to Jesus and they said to him, "We have caught this woman in the very act of adultery. Now, the law says that she must be stoned to death. But what do you say?" So again, they were tempting him, because if Jesus says, according to the law of Moses, that she should be stoned, then the Romans will arrest Jesus for murder. If Jesus says she should not be stoned, then he would be in violation of the law of Moses, and no true prophet would break the law of Moses. So that, again, that was one of those things that what they're trying to do is they're trying to pin or to pit Jesus against both the law of Moses and Roman law to get him to be criminalized in everything that he's doing, but he doesn't go along with any of the things that they say. So again, we touched on Matthew chapter 5, we touched on Matthew chapter 19, and we also specifically talked about Mark chapter 10. And in all of these cases, again, every one of these instances, Jesus answers the question differently. There's a significant detail in which he clarifies something. He is actually, his responses that he gives, he actually offers a response that basically brings the men down and the women up to basically level the playing field between men and women. And that was what he did in his responses. And if you guys have questions about that in detail, I recommend you guys look up the link of the video that we did in the last Bible study with the women. So in some of these verses that we read in Matthew and in Mark, there's, as far as the practical application, there's other verses in the New Testament that also specifically address the issue. And so if you can turn real quick to Romans chapter 7, and I just want to kind of finish or off on this one portion about the practical application, because again, according to the Bible, divorce is not a sin. Okay? Divorce is not a sin. To put away a woman, okay, again, in the Old Testament, the pagan world, and even in the New Testament, in the pagan world, men would put away their wives as a form of divorce, but that is a violation of the law of Moses. So God was not against divorce, he was against the putting away, which, by the way, the one of the verses that is often quoted as a way of justifying the claim that the divorce is a sin is the verse where it says that God hates divorce. Well, there is no verse in the Bible that says that God hates divorce. In the English translation, we might actually read a verse that says that God hates divorce, but in the Hebrew, it doesn't say that. In the Hebrew, it says that God hates the putting away. And he hates that because it basically, many women who were put away were forced into prostitution. And that wasn't something that God wanted because the way the culture worked in those days. But anyway, so going to Romans chapter 7, we're going to read verses 1 through 6. So if somebody can start reading, just read verses 1 through 6.
Romans 7, 1 through 6. I can read it. I can look
Go
at
for it. Read it.
I'm trying to give everybody else a chance. You know how I always jump at it. All right. So, know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if, while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in spirit and not in the oldness of the letter.
All right. So thank you for that slow-mo moment there. I appreciate it. But yeah, so okay, so Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. Let me put this a little bit in context. This is one of those passages where if you were to read this in conjunction with the Matthew chapter 5, verses 31, 32, where it says that a man who marries a woman who's divorced commits adultery, against that's the wrong way to read it. But when you have that coupled with this, you can understand why the Catholic Church would have marriage as a sacrament, because as long as her husband is alive, she marries another, she commits an act of adultery. So therefore, you can't divorce, right? But here's the problem. Paul starts this off with a caveat. All right. Paul has Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 5 in mind when he says, I speak to them that know the law. Paul's focus is addressing the law of remarriage after death. Do you understand that? If you remember, go back to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 5. If the husband dies, she is free to marry another person. Okay. But it's also an error to assume that Paul believes that under no circumstance at all, a woman cannot be married to another man if her first husband is alive. All right. If you read Deuteronomy 24, it clearly stipulates that this is only in effect if her husband does not give her a bill of divorcement. Right? Because as long as he doesn't give her a bill of divorcement, she is still legally married. When it says her husband, it assumes that he has not given her a bill of divorcement. So the thing that we tend to read into these passages, a whole lot of things that really don't really exist. Okay. Paul's language is pretty clear. Once a bill of divorcement is given, the man is no longer her husband and the woman is no longer his wife. The fact that Paul's language is specific, it demonstrates that when he says her husband, it is assumed that a writing of divorcement was not issued. If the writing of divorcement had been issued, she would no longer be his wife and she would be free to remarry according to the law of Moses. So Paul is connecting the divorce and putting away with adultery as it relates to her not having a bill of divorcement according to the law of Moses. He's addressing a situation in which a woman who does not have a bill of divorcement in writing in her hand, who ends up marrying another man, that woman commits adultery. That's what Jesus said. Okay. This woman for whom, okay, again, for those who know the law, okay, this woman would be considered an adulteress. The only exception is made in the event of the death of her husband. So we have to remember that when we look at these passages in the New Testament, Paul is not going off on a tangent that is contradictory to the law of Moses. In fact, he is actually enforcing the law of Moses. He's not saying anything that the law of Moses doesn't stipulate. But the problem is that the law of Moses is, well, let's say it's actually a little vague. If you think about it, it just says if a man comes to a point where he just doesn't like his wife and he decides to to leave her. He says that basically he needs to write her a bill of divorcement, give it into her hand and send her out of the house, right? And she's free to marry another man. And then if she, remarries, and that latter husband, the second husband, decide he hates her or whatever, and he decides, you know what, I want to get rid, and he gives her a writing of divorcement. Or if he dies, right, she is still not allowed to go back to the first husband. She's free to remarry again, but she can't go back to the first husband. Okay. It's just it uses a small snippet of a situation. It is not an overarching response to all situations in regards to divorce. This is why I think that there's a reason for the way that this law is written. And we're going to kind of get into that today. Okay. Why is the law of Moses so vague? Why doesn't it give a greater, more detailed response, like in different situations? Like the other day, I was looking at the different laws with regards to divorce and remarriage and all kinds of different stuff. And the laws have, like, these conditions, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We're looking for all of those letters. We don't have that. In the law of Moses, we're not given a list of circumstances under which this law would apply. The law itself is extremely vague, and it's written like that for a reason. It wasn't to encourage divorce at all. As a matter of fact, even though divorce was practiced in Israel, you don't see any divorce being mentioned at all in scripture between human beings. Okay. But I'm going to get more on that later. I don't want to jump ahead of myself. There's one more passage in the Gospel of Luke. If you could turn to Luke chapter 16. All right. So Luke chapter 16, there's one verse that I want to touch on. Just go to verse 18. And this is what verse 18 says: whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her that is put away, correct translation, from her husband committeth adultery. So again, we have this one verse. Now, there's a real problem with this verse. And I'd like to start by going back to Luke chapter 15, because in order for you to get the impact of this verse, you need to look at everything that is said that leading up to this verse. Okay. So let's see here. So Jesus, in verse 1 of Luke chapter 15, it says, then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. Now, who are the publicans? Anybody answer the question? What is a publican?
Is that a tax
A
collector?
tax collector.
Tax collector, right? So we're talking about somebody who collects money, collects taxes for Rome. Okay. And it says, all the publicans, all the tax collectors and sinners came near to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And then he spoke a parable to them. Now he's talking to the Pharisees now. He's not talking to the sinners or the publicans. He's talking to the Pharisees. And he says, what man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after that which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I say unto you, likewise, joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons which need no repentance. Now, before we move on, scroll back up real quick. One of the things that you need to recognize is that in Israel was an agrarian culture. Okay. Now, what do I mean by that? An agrarian culture is a culture that is mostly people who are farmers They have cattle of all kinds. They are they're not so much a nomadic people. They're not people who don't have a land or anything. They have their own lands, but they're very agriculturally oriented. Most of the laws of Moses centered around even the feast days were around certain times of the harvests of the year. Everything about Jewish culture was an agrarian culture. It was a culture that was built on the concepts of agriculture. Okay, so because they were built on the concepts of agriculture, when Jesus starts referring to something like, which man of you having 100 sheep? Now, when you and I read that, we're just trying to get the spiritual meaning of what he's saying. You know, the sheep that was lost is a sinner, and we just want to get the sinner saved. But to the Jewish people who were hearing Jesus, they understood it differently. They would have heard this. It's like a man who has 100 sheep. Wow, if a guy has 100 sheep, then that means he's got goods. Why? Because 100 sheep can produce a lot of wool that could be sold. They could produce a lot of milk that could be sold, right? They could produce all kinds of goods that they could have sold in order to produce income. So all of these things, and when it comes to sheep was part of their livelihood. As an agrarian culture, sheep is a livelihood of the people who are listening to him. We're talking about publicans and sinners. We're talking about Pharisees. We're talking about everybody understood when they talk about sheep, they're talking about something that produces income, something that produces them a resource of income, of finance. Okay. I don't want this to get lost on you, because you're going to see that this theme of finance is actually all woven into this chapter. Let's go on to the next part of this chapter. Go ahead, scroll down real quick. Verse 8. And he says, look at what Jesus says. Either what woman having 10 pieces of silver, money, okay, if she loses one piece, does not light a candle and sweep the house and diligently seek till she finds it. Why is this important? Jesus is making a point here. He says, and when she has found it, she calls her friends and her neighbors together, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the place which I had lost. All right. Or I had found the peace which I had lost. Likewise, I say to you, there's joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth. Now, again, we read this parable and we think, oh, he's just talking about the one person who got lost, and we want to see the sinner get born again and saved. Again, to the people who are listening to Jesus, they have a different perspective in mind. They are associating a piece of silver. All right. In the ancient world, silver and gold they were items of currency. They were hard money. Okay. And one of the things that they did in order to increase the amount of money in circulation was they used to take gold and they used to mix it together with lesser metals like copper, bronze, and they used to mix it up in order to produce more, which by the way, that's what the Romans did, and it ended up resulting in the downfall of the Roman Empire because of hyperinflation, which, by the way, is exactly what's happening right now with America. But that's another conversation for another time. But here's the thing that I wanted you to notice, though, is that it's talking about silver, a piece of silver, which means that a piece of silver, it was a considerable amount of money, because all of the other coins were diluted with fake metals that weren't precious. And he's referring to silver that is precious, that was a unit of exchange in order to purchase goods. And what's interesting is that in Jewish culture, silver is often attributed or associated with judgment, with the purification of judgment. Okay, so he's saying that what woman having 10 pieces of silver, if she loses one piece, does not light a candle? Again, he uses 10, right? Because 10 in the Jewish mind refers to the 10 commandments. It refers to the moral law. right? And so she lost one. And so the concept of judgment, right, for lacking in morality, right? But it's using the context of money that people understand. Okay. Again, so the first one that we talked about, we're talking about the livelihood of people. The second one here, he's specifically talking about money. All right. Now let's keep reading. Verse 11. And this is a third parable now Jesus talks. And he goes, he said, a certain man had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me a portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. Not many days after, the young son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country and wasted substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land. And he began to be in want, and he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. And he sent him unto his fields to feed swine. And when he would have fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave to him. And when he came to himself, he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put on a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked, what are these things meant? And he said to him, thy brother is come, thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. And answering said to his father, lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him the fatted calf. And he said to him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found. Now, wait a minute, don't go on, don't move on yet. I want to touch on this real quick. I want you to consider now, again, we have to consider all of the cultural implications of what's happening. The first thing that Jesus talked about was the living of a person. The next thing, he talks about a woman dealing with money. Okay. In this one, you have both a living and a money being used in the parable of the prodigal son. All right. The prodigal son, he's obviously very wealthy because of his father. He tells his dad, he says, I want you to give me the value of all the stuff that's my part of the inheritance. So basically the father's like, all right, fine. So here's your half. And he sells it, takes all the money, and he wastes it. And then after a whole bunch of problems, he comes back. Now, we in the West, we just want to get to the principle of the thing, right? We just want to say, well, he was like somebody who backslid, who went away, and God wants to bring him back home eventually so that he is fully restored back. Again, to the people who are listening to him, this goes much deeper because these are farmers. These are people that these things happen to all the time. Okay. He uses language that is specific. Like he says that he had to go feed swine, which to the Jewish culture, you're not supposed to touch them. He's not just so separated from his father. He's utterly unclean. You're not even allowed to touch the body of an animal because it's considered unclean. Okay. It's and all of this has to do because of money. because he took all of his father's living that would have been given to him in his inheritance, and instead he goes ahead and hands it off. He cashes out and wastes everything on with whores and with all kinds of stuff, right? And then he finally comes back, and his brother's all upset, and his father comes out and says, hey, cut your brother some slack. Yeah, he screwed up, but he is your brother. And besides, all that I have is yours anyway. You could, you say that I've never even given you anything. All that I have is yours. Just, you can take what you want, you've always, and besides, I trust you because you've been obedient, so you have this exchange happening. But I want you to understand that Jesus is using money and the living and making a living as a context for these parables. Okay, now go to the next chapter. We're going to go now to chapter 16, verse 1. And he said also to his disciples. Now he's talking to the disciples. He was talking to the Pharisees. Now he's addressing the disciples. These are the people who are in his camp, people who believe in him. There was a certain rich man which had a steward. The same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And he called to him and said to him, how is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest no longer be steward. And then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig. To beg, I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, how much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, take thy bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And then said he unto another, how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said unto him, take thy bill and write 80. And the Lord commended, now stop right there, don't scroll up any further. The Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? All right, let's stop right there for just a minute. And if you have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and he will love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, all the way up until this point, Jesus is now getting into the fifth parable. And in this situation, again, Jesus brings up the topic of money. Okay? He uses it as a model to talk about people coming out of the world and back into the fold, so to speak, back into fellowship with God, right? But again, the people hearing this hear something different. Okay, go back up to the top of the chapter again, in the beginning of Luke. All right, and he is talking about a unjust steward. Now, who is a steward? A steward is usually somebody who is employed by a wealthy landowner. And the steward is responsible for basically managing his entire estate. That's what a steward is responsible for. All right. In other words, he's responsible for taking care of someone else's wealth. That's what a steward is. And there was and Jesus starts this, he says that there was a certain rich man. Again, we're talking about a person with affluence, with money, okay, who had a steward, and he was accused of wasting his master's goods. And he said, how is it that I hear this of you? Give an account of your stewardship. I want an accounting. Show me that you haven't really stolen anything. And then he starts to wane. And what does he do? He says, what shall I do? For my Lord, he knows that he screwed up. He knows that he's done wrong and he can't hide it. It's the cat's out of the bag. He says, my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I can't dig, and to beg I am ashamed. He says, I've never done hard labor, and I'm just too ashamed to beg. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm screwed, right? The Scrooge steward. And he says, I know what I'm going to do. So when I am put out of my stewardship, they may receive me into their houses, right? This is what he does. Look at what happens here. Now, this is where things really start to take a turn, because everything up until now is we've seen money. We've seen one person who has good intentions and another person with bad intentions. One person with wealth who has a good set of rules that he follows, and another person who breaks all the rules. Okay, we're seeing all of this. And here we have the same situation. We have a rich master and a wretched steward. Okay, but look at what the steward does, because this is the part that I think confuses a lot of people. And I'm going to explain it to you so that you're never going to be confused about it again. Okay. So in verse 5, scroll up real quick, put verse 5 at the top. All right. It says, so he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him. He basically calls up everybody who owes his master money. Okay. And he said to the first, how much do you owe my Lord? Now, here, I have a question. His master is telling him he wants him to give an account. Okay. I want you to think, this is 1st century. Does anybody have a cell phone? Does anybody have email? No, right? Is there an internet? Is there a TV in everybody's house where they can look at the news, what's happening? No, right? So every one of these people who owes his master money, they know that he's the steward, but they don't know that he's getting fired. They don't know any of this. As far as they know, he is representing his master, his Lord, right? So when he talks to them, the people think that he is operating in the authority of the one that they owe money to. He's the steward. He's the one here. He's the collector for the guy that I owe money to. So he says, how much do you owe? Right? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. So now the steward is giving this guy a 50% discount. I want you to think about what's happening here. He says, no, don't worry. He says, your bill's been cut in half. And then he says to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he says, you know what, take your bill, write down 4 score. 4 score is 80. A score is 20. So 4 score is 80. So instead of owing a full 100, now he only owes 80. Gives him a 20% discount. Right? And look at what, now think about this. These people owe him, or not him, they owe his master money. He's telling them, he tells one guy, you got a 50% discount. He tells another guy, you got a 20% discount. And look at what his master says. Let me ask you a question. How would you feel if all the people that owed you money suddenly came back and said, yeah, but your steward said that you gave me like a 50% discount on what I owe you? How would you feel?
Well, most people would be really upset.
He just swindled me out of all
There's
this
a
money.
reason I fired him.
Right? There's a good reason I fired him, right? But look at what happens in verse 8. And the Lord commended the unjust steward. Why does he do that? Because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Now, I want, if everybody has a camera on them, put your hand up if you feel that that's confusing as heck. Even my daughter raised up her hand. She's like, why did he do that? I'm going to tell you why. Because this guy, this steward, he knows that he screwed up. But when he calls up, he knows that he's going to swindle his Lord out of a lot of money. He knows that. But that's not what's in play here. What's in play is that he is communicating to the master, to his master. He's basically saying, look, I know, he's not communicating to his master. He's basically saying this: I'm going to get good with these people, and I'm going to position myself to where if I needed help, these people are going to help me, because I, as the steward of the master, they know that I gave them a huge break, right? But I know that my master is good. I know that my master is better than all the other masters of the land. Even though I screwed him over, I know that I messed up really bad, but I know that he's good. And because he's good, he's not going to change what I said. Do you understand? He knows that his master, Jesus is giving a parable in which his Lord is representative of God, and that God is good, and that God knows that in order to not disparage his own reputation, he's not going to change the good that the steward did for those guys, even though he got swindled out of the money. You understand? Because he wants to keep his reputation. He wants the people to know that he's a good Lord. Okay? So I want you to keep this in mind as we continue reading. Okay? So look at what he says in verse 9 now. Scroll up again real quick. Verse 9. All right, bring it up to the top. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. Jesus is telling you, he says, make to yourselves friends of the mammon. How? Right? In the same way that the steward did. In other words, if you decide that you're not going to be a part of the household that made you wealthy, that blessed you and all that, at least talk or speak well of your Lord on your way out. At least speak well of him, because he is good. Okay? This is what he's talking about. He says, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness. But when you do it the way he did. Don't talk bad about your God, right? Now look at what he says. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also. I'm sorry, if he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? Now here's something that you need to understand. Why is Jesus referring to mammon? Mammon was in the regions of the Middle East, particularly that area that he was in. Mammon was considered a pagan deity of money. Okay, Mammon was a false god of money. Now this is important, because this is what Jesus is talking about. Where the entire time, every parable that Jesus has talked about, he's talked about somebody who was living in sin and coming back home, somebody who had lost something that was found, right? Something of value. But Jesus is using that as the framework for this part of his whole dissertation. Jesus is not talking about just a person simply being reconciled back to God. He's talking about someone leaving the world and the gods of this world to come back to the true God. He's talking, what he's referring to, he's using something that has the greatest potential to corrupt, which is the whole thing about wealth. Okay. He's using all of that in order to bring people to an understanding that it's about returning their loyalty back to Yahweh, back to the God of Israel. That's what he's referring to. So he says here in verse 13, all right? If you could scroll up until verse 17 on the bottom. No. Go down all the way down until verse 17 is on the bottom. Until verse 17 is on the bottom. Not the top, the bottom. There you go. There, right there. All right. And it says here, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. and the Pharisees. Now, he's saying here, you cannot serve the God of Israel and you cannot serve the God of money. You just can't. Because that's the whole point that Jesus is trying to make here. And he's appealing to the sinners and to the Pharisees. Okay? And he says, and the Pharisees also who were covetous heard all these things and they derided him. What is it? Right? All of these things that he's talking about. Now he says that the Pharisees who are covetous heard all these things. Now, why is this one detail given in the passage? Why do you think this one detail is given there? Does anybody know? Does anybody have an idea? Why does it say who were covetous? What does it mean to be covetous?
To be jealous?
Do anybody understand what I mean by covetous?
To desire something that someone else has, right?
Yeah, so to covet means to desire something, okay, that doesn't belong to you. Somebody real quick, read Colossians chapter 3, verse 5.
Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil.
Concupiscence.
Say what?
Yeah, okay, I got that. Skip that part. Just gotta keep reading.
And covetousness, which is idolatry.
So covetousness, which is idolatry. So according to go back to that passage that we were reading in Luke. He is saying here, it says, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve the God of Israel and the God of money. And the Pharisees who were covetous, those are people who desired money. These are people who were committing idolatry. Now, I want you to think about this. Covetousness is what? Idolatry, right? They're the ones, they're hearing all of the things that Jesus is talking about, and they began to deride him. They began to put him down with their words. Now look at what happens. And he said to them, you are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. I want you guys to highlight verse 15 real quick. But he says, and the law and the prophets were until John. And since that time, the kingdom of God is preached and every man presses into it. And scroll up. And the law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached and every man presses into it. And it is easier for heaven and earth to pass than one tittle of the law to fail. Whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another. Straight out of left field. What the heck is he talking about? He was just talking about money. He's talking about the God of Israel versus the God of money. He's talking about all of this stuff. And suddenly, boom, this on, boom, right? Left, straight out of left field, he comes out with this thing about putting away the wife and marrying another and committing adultery. Whosoever marries her that is put away from her husband commits adultery. Look at the next verse. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen. Okay, can somebody just honestly tell me, does it seem to make any sense as to why Jesus would infuse this thing about adultery? Does it make any sense in the context of everything he's talking about? It doesn't. It doesn't seem to make sense right off the bat.
All right, bro, you better let us know because I'm really curious about this too. I'm like, wait, why would you just throw that in there?
There's a mic drop coming, guys. Just there's a moment, like it's coming. I know how he talks. Like I've seen a lot of these Bible studies with Stan. Like mic drop is coming.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the part that I want you to consider. Okay. In the previous study, and again, if the ladies who are on right now, they probably would remember this. I had mentioned how that one of the biggest problems with divorce and remarriage, in divorce, particularly in the Old Testament, and particularly with putting away, was that one of the problems was when men would acquire great wealth. When they could acquire great wealth, sometimes the women were neglected. If she was married to a man who acquired great wealth, now he can afford to have multiple wives who are younger, who had, who can do things that she may not be willing to do. Okay. There are all kinds of things that the acquisition of new wealth was something that could cause a man to get rid of. It's like, I don't want her anymore. I don't need her anymore. You understand? The concept of of getting money was a way in which men would forsake the wives of their youth. They would neglect them and actually cause them, they would put away their wives. And especially if there was some kind of disagreement between the husband and the wife, that any feelings of bitterness that the husband would have toward her, if he hated her for any reason, he would put her away and he would force her into a life that of immorality, and the culture itself would view her as it's her fault. It's just the way the culture worked at that time. Okay. Now, this is, I want you to kind of go back a little bit, a couple verses where Jesus talks about abomination. If you could go up real quick. Okay. Where's the verse that says, go down a little bit further. I think it's in verse 9, I think. 9 or 10. Keep going, keep going. Oh, right there, verse 15. So he says, and he said to them, you are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knoweth your hearts, for that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God. This is the part, okay, where you and I, this is where we're making the transition into the real reason for this study. The mic drop moment, okay? That's what this is, okay? So Jesus uses this word abomination. That's a very strong word. Jesus said that that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God, okay? Let me just tell you something. Concerning the word abomination, the Old Testament uses the word in certain contexts, okay? It uses the word abomination in relation to the misappropriation of a peace offering. It also uses abomination in regards to unclean foods that were forbidden to be consumed. It uses abomination to refer to impure sexual expression, and that included specifically to two things: homosexuality and cross-dressing. Two things that were specifically associated with the word abomination. It was also associated, or abomination was used as a reference to human sacrifice, sorcery, and witchcraft, and everything of that nature. Okay. Also, it was related to idolatry and the worship of other gods. And by the way, this last part, this one about the idolatry and the worship of other gods, is the biggest one. That's the most predominant use of the word abomination, is in the context of going after other gods, of worshiping other gods and committing idolatry. Okay. And the other time that abomination is mentioned is in the passage about divorce and remarriage, where it talks about how that if a woman is divorced from her first husband and marries another, and then the second husband divorces her, or if he dies, if she were to remarry the first husband after that she had already gotten married to another man, for whatever reason, if she had gotten divorced or became a widow, if she went back to the first husband and if he remarried her, that he would be committing an abomination to the Lord. Going back to that is an abomination. And furthermore, okay, Abomination is often associated with everything that God considers detestable. Detestable. All right. The Hebrew word is called harem for detestable. And it literally means everything that is dedicated to destruction. Okay. I'm telling you, every single thing we're touching on right now is leading up to this mic drop moment. Okay. Now, while there's no mention of, fornication or anything like that in the passage in Luke, okay, the chapter is focusing on faithfulness and the use of money. Apart from a cultural context of how rich men live their lives, it would make no sense as to why Jesus would even mention a marital issue in the midst of a financial discourse. But because of man's abuse of power, they became wealthy, and it was common for abuse to increase with the acquisition of new wealth. Now, I want you to consider some of the things that Paul says in the New Testament, okay? Because this is echoed by Paul. Somebody turn to read for me 1 Timothy chapter 6. First Timothy 6. Verse 10.
For the love of money is the root of all evil, which, while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows.
So notice what he says. If the love of money is the root of all evil, that means that there is no evil thing that is not associated with the love of money, including idolatry, by the way. How did they build idols? They would take gold, silver, stone, whatever, and they would chisel out these idols, right? Which, by the way, cost money, okay? And the thing is that they would use, when Israel came out of Egypt, they had idols of gold and silver, okay? These things were all used, that the worship of idols was associated with the love of money, all right? Many of the people in the ancient world who had idol temples, their idol temples were all designed to acquire wealth for the priesthood, okay? So with that being said, in this passage in 1 Timothy 6, he is actually using language that is similar when it talks about piercing himself through with many sorrows. It's actually language that is similar to the structure of Proverbs chapter 6, all right, where it specifically addresses those men who are seduced by the adulterous woman, okay? That all of these things, all of the things that happens to the man who surrenders himself to the adulterous woman, all of the sorrows are listed of the things that he endures after, okay, that he goes through as a result. So there's a direct link in the above passage between adultery and riches, okay? Whether Jesus' statement or Paul's letter or Solomon's proverb all have the same context in mind. Jesus's reference to "you cannot serve God and mammon" is interesting because he is addressing the worship of a different God, that is a God that is other than Yahweh. This is the exact opposite of what it means to serve the true living God. It is a violation of the covenant. All right. Go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. Anybody knows what Exodus 20 is about? Right off the bat without looking? It's the 10 Commandments. All right.
I was going to say that's the generational curses one that I always hit.
What does it say in verse 3?
Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Now go to chapter 23 of the same book. 23, and read verses 10 through 13.
And 6 years thou shalt sow thy land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof. But the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still, that the poor of thy people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner thou shalt deal with thy vineyard and with thy olive yard. 6 days 6 days thou shalt do thy work, and on the 7th day thou shalt rest, that thine ox and thine ass may rest, and the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. And in all things that I have said unto you, be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of thy mouth.
Okay. Why did I include this passage in Exodus? Okay. This is extremely important because of where we're going with this. Okay. God told the children of Israel, I want you to consider the context, how God says, don't even mention the name of other gods. Don't let it be heard out of your mouth, right? Here's the interesting part. God had told the children of Israel that they were supposed to do work on the land for 6 straight years. On the 7th year, they were supposed to do no work on the land, none whatsoever. Okay. And God said, and this is in Leviticus 26, I think, 24 through 26, I think it's the one where it says where God specifically addresses this aspect that is addressing here in Exodus. Okay. He elaborates on it. And he says that you're going to work for 6 years and you're going to not work on the 7th year to give a Sabbath of the land. He says, but just so you're taken care of, on the 6th year, I'm going to give you 3 times as much. I'm going to give you 3 times to cover the 6th year, and then to cover the 7th year, and to cover the 8th year, which is the next cycle of 7s, because you still have to do the harvest. You have to plant everything and everything. So God was going to give them 3 times as much on the 6th year. Okay. But the children of Israel got greedy. They ended up working it anyway. They're like, well, the law says I'm not supposed to do any work in the land, but I don't want I want to keep doing the work. So for hundreds of years, the children of Israel still did the work of the land. And because of that, because for, I think it was 490 years, the children of Israel did not observe the Sabbath of the land because of their greed, because they wanted to continue making profits on the years that God told them not to do work on the land. And so as a result, they got kicked out of the land. The whole thing with Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar coming and taking over Israel and kicking them out and making them scattered around the world. That whole event happened because God specifically said that because for 490 years, you did not observe the Sabbath of the land. That's a total of 70 Sabbaths of years. I'm going to kick you out of the land to make up for all of the Sabbaths that you missed. That's why they were kicked out of the land. They were originally kicked out only for 70 years. And unfortunately, after the 70 years, and the what do you call it? The part that actually talks about this is actually in Jeremiah. Let me see here. Share. See, in Jeremiah. Sorry, give me 1 second here. I think it's in Jeremiah 25, I think. See here, I just want to make sure. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much. I have to find the verse But basically it says that the people were kicked out of the land for 70 years to make up for the 70 years of Sabbaths that they had missed. Okay. And so and the reason why they missed it was because of their greed, their desire to make a profit. All right. And when God promised them that he would take care of them, they chose to ignore the statute. And as a result, they were kicked out of the land. Okay. So when it says that which is highly esteemed among men is abomination in the sight of God is telling, because he uses the same language that God gave warnings against for practices that the men of other nations would do when they worshiped other gods. Okay. In Leviticus 18:26 and Deuteronomy 7:25 through 26. Now, here's where we're starting to get up to the crescendo moment of the mic drop. Okay. Israel had a covenant with God. That covenant was based on Israel committing herself to worshiping only Yahweh. Yahweh being her only God and not sharing his glory with another. Between Israel and God, Israel was unfaithful. And it was Israel who committed adultery with the gods of other nations. Israel ended up going after other gods. Now, I want you to think about this, okay? Because what are we talking about? We're talking about the laws of divorce and remarriage, right? God demonstrated numerous times that he had tried to get her back, but Israel refused. Somebody turn to Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah chapter 3. Somebody read from verses 12 through 25.
All right, I'll read 12 through 25.
Yeah.
Go and proclaim these words toward the north, and say, Return, thou backsliding Israel, saith the Lord. And I will not cause mine anger to fall upon you, for I am merciful, saith the Lord, and I will not keep anger forever. Only acknowledge thine iniquity, that thou hast transgressed against the Lord thy God, and hast scattered thy ways to the strangers under every green tree, and ye have not obeyed my voice, saith the Lord. Turn, O backsliding Israel, O backsliding children, saith the Lord, for I am married to you, and I will take you one of a city, and two of a family, and I will bring you to Zion, and I will give you pastors according to mine heart, which shall feed you with knowledge and understanding. And it shall come to pass, when ye be multiplied and increased in the land, and in those days, saith the Lord, they shall say no more, the ark of the covenant of the Lord, neither shall it come to mind, neither shall they remember it, neither shall they visit it, neither shall that be done any more. At that time they shall call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all the nations shall be gathered unto it, to the name of the Lord, to Jerusalem. Neither shall they walk any more after the imagination of their evil heart. In those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers. But I said, How shall I put thee among the children, and give thee a pleasant land, a goodly heritage of hosts of nations, of the host of nations? And I said, Thou shalt call me my father, and shalt not turn away from me. Surely, as a wife treacherously departeth from her husband, so have ye dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. A voice was heard upon the high places, weeping and supplications of the children of Israel, for they have perverted their way, and they have forgotten the Lord their God. Return, ye backsliding children, and I will heal your backslidings. Behold, I will come unto thee, for thou art the Lord thy our God. Truly in vain is salvation hoped for from the hills, and from the multitude of mountains. Truly in the Lord our God is the salvation of Israel. For shame hath devoured the labor of our fathers from our youth, their flocks and their hens, their sons and their daughters. We lie down in our shame, and our confusion covereth us, for we have sinned against the Lord our God, we and our fathers, from our youth even unto this day, and have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God.
All right. Let me tell you something. The entire book of Jeremiah is literally God pleading with Israel to return back to himself. Okay. Jeremiah is among those prophets that is after he's actually one of the prophets that is preparing, warning Israel because the King Nebuchadnezzar hasn't come yet. But Jeremiah knows that he's coming. And Jeremiah is the one who talks about the 70 years that they were kicked out. Because remember, why did they get kicked out of the land for 70 years? What was the problem that they had? It was greed, right? Because of their greed, because of their love for money. Okay. And here in Jeremiah, it talks about that. Go real quick, scroll up to verse 9 real quick. Look at what it says in verse 9. And it came to pass through the lightness of her whoredom that she defiled the land and committed adultery with stones and with stocks. And yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah hath not turned unto me with her whole heart, but vainly, saith the Lord. All right. Somebody turn real quick to Hosea chapter 2, verse 2. Mic drop moment coming, guys. All right. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight and her adulteries from between her breasts. Why would God say this? Why would God say this in Hosea? Because remember what I told you guys earlier, how that that there was no divorce ever recorded in the Old Testament between men, even though God made provision about it. Because in the Old Testament, there's only one divorce that's actually recorded. Just one. And it's the divorce of God from Israel. God divorces Israel. Did you guys, how many of you guys were aware that that he actually divorced her? Remember, go back to Jeremiah chapter 3 again. Now go to verse 8.
I do that, but I never thought of it being, that's the only one that was recorded. I never thought about that.
Look at this, Jeremiah
It's
chapter
the
3,
only
verse
one
8.
recorded in the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's the only divorce recorded. Look at what it says in verse 8. Look at what it says in verse 8. And I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. So guess what? In the Old Testament, God divorces Israel. But look, remember what I said in the previous Bible study. When you look at the law of Moses says what? The law of Moses says that when, this is the mic drop moment, guys, by the way, that you're about to, it's going to be a big pill to swallow, okay? So in the law of Moses, it says that if a man divorces his wife, and I said this in the study, okay? If a man divorces his wife, she's free to marry another man. However, the law stipulates that if she marries another person and then gets divorced or becomes a widow, she's not allowed to come back. But if she never remarries, if she stays single, then it is assumed that she can go back to her husband. Do you understand? The only time that it becomes a violation for her to go back to her original husband is if after she divorces him, she then remarries to another man. At that point, for her, she's now become defiled and can no longer be, or can no longer go back to the first husband. Is everybody clear on that? Does that make sense? Right? So,
Stan, can I ask you a quick question?
yeah.
Is that okay? To make sure that I'm following you right, is basically her only having been with one person if she never remarried.
Right.
Because if she comes back, she really was only with one person.
Exactly. She's
Okay,
never been with more than one person, right? That's exactly the point I'm trying to make.
Okay.
So now I want you to think. So God divorces Israel, and he keeps telling her, come back to me, come back to me. I will forgive your whoredoms. I'm going to forgive all the stuff that you do. Just come back to me. I'll forgive you. I'll forgive you. I'll forgive you. But then later on, down the road, something happens. Mic drop moment. Malachi chapter 2. Go ahead. Malachi chapter 2. M-A-L.
Just MAL too. MAL too.
Yeah, M-A-L 2. All right. Go to verse 11. And I want somebody to read verse 11.
I'll read it.
All right.
Judah, here we go. Judah hath dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem.
Abomination.
For
Look at that.
an abomination. For Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord which he loved, and hath married the daughter of a strange god.
What? What was that? What
He
just
married the
happened?
daughter. He married the daughter of a strange god.
So Judah profaned and committed abomination in Israel by marrying the daughter of a strange god. Now, what does that tell you?
That means Israel can't go back.
It means
Judah
that
can't
Israel
go back to
can't
the
go
Lord.
back to the Lord under the old covenant. She can't go back. Look, the Old Testament says that God divorces Israel, and there's no record that he ever took her
Wow.
back. There's no record that God ever took her back.
Wow.
So because now think about this. She is now defiled because God, remember how I told you he worded it a certain way in Deuteronomy? He worded it that way in anticipation of this. Because now Israel cannot come. He cannot come back to the Lord under the old covenant because now he's defiled. It's unlawful for Israel to come back to Yahweh under the old covenant because the law that says that they are now defiled, it's an abomination.
I have a question. So,
Yeah.
so this has to do. See, now I'm thinking back to the Godhead study.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking back to the Godhead. And is this why in the new covenant our relationship is different?
Yes. Okay. This is what we're going into right now.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
All right. Okay. Now I want to show.
I
Now,
have a question.
okay. Go for it.
Well, maybe I should be quiet.
Ask. Go
Well,
ahead.
if the Jews have Western like ours, then they have the same scripture in Malachi that they've committed this abomination. They understand the marriage covenant better than we would. So why would they even try to go back to the law?
Why did they
Based
break
on
it
the
to
fact
begin with?
that they can't go back.
That's the whole point. Well, see, God has a prescription for that. Turn to Jeremiah chapter 31.
I knew I should have.
Which one was it? Jeremiah what?
Jeremiah 31.
Oh, 31.
Jamal, you're cutting off a lot.
Yeah, we can't hear a word you're saying, Jamal, man. That's a
No, he's muted. That's his slow down signal.
He's
coming
not
through.
muted.
All right. I want somebody to read verses 31 to 34. Richie, why don't you read that? Verses 31 to 34. In light of everything we just read.
Oh my God, this is more than one mic drop. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break. They break. Although I was, Siani, please, you have to lower your voice. Although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord, but this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. and they shall teach shall oh my god and they sorry, I can't even speak today. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more.
All right. So this passage is talking about the new covenant that we have in Jesus Christ. It became necessary for God to establish another covenant by which he could reconcile all the nations that he disinherited and Israel, whom he divorced. It was the only way. The only way that Israel can come to God now is by the Messiah, because they cannot go back under the law of Moses. This new covenant, this new covenant is between Israel and Judah and God through his son. This is the whole point. The whole divorce and remarriage Bible study is to show you that there is no way to God other than through the new covenant. Israel cannot be reconciled back to God under the law of Moses. He divorced Israel and Judah remarried. You can't. It's an abomination to God. God said it that way so that when the new covenant came, God said, behold, I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the one that I made with their forefathers in the wilderness, which covenant they broke, even though I was a husband to them. But he's no longer a husband to them.
Father, no.
Do you understand? He's no longer a husband to now in this new covenant, he's a father forever.
So this kind of also destroys the notion that there was because I know that there's a lot of teachings, like especially with Hebrew people that focus a lot on the Jewish scriptures, where they're like, no, it's not a new covenant. It's just a continuation of the old covenant. Like this actually completely destroys that notion, because like it has to be a new covenant, because under the old covenant, God could not reconcile Israel back to himself because they married another God.
Exactly.
So this is essentially, this is a completely different covenant. Like this is totally different.
Now, remember the verse that we read earlier, like when we first started the study today, how that I think it was in Romans. I think it was Romans chapter, what was it? Romans chapter 7, where I said that, wherefore, my brethren, you also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that you should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. That was in Romans 7. Everything that Jesus did, remember what the law of Moses said? It said, if she either remarries, it says, if she remarries, if her second husband either divorces her or if he dies, right? So she can't go back to her first husband. Both concepts are covered in the sacrifice of Christ. Because she's been divorced by God, she ended up remarrying the daughter of a strange God, and yet through Jesus, his death frees her. His death, God will apply his death to
That's
all.
why he said it's to those who know the law.
Yes. So that all he came under the law to redeem those that were under the law, so that through his obedience, those that were out of the law can be reconciled back to. This is part of the massive effort of God to set the record, to settle all accounts. That through Jesus, he can forever settle all accounts. He can fulfill the law as an obedient son, and yet be the institutor of a new covenant, a better covenant with better promises.
That's why there's Jew or Greek, there's no separation, because all accounts were balanced, whether you were pagan or Jew.
Yes, because you're no longer either. You're a new creation under a new covenant.
Wow.
So this is like stuff like this, like stuff like this is what gives me such confidence in the word of God. I mean, like, think about it. God had every single aspect covered.
Yes.
Like every minute detail, like the stuff that I'm learning right now, like you don't even think about, but every minute detail, every specific word, everything is covered. Like God covered it all. Man, it's just amazing. This is so incredible.
In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, it says, "For he hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him." I want you to think of how loaded a statement that is. Because according to that verse, Jesus was made the embodiment of sin for our sake. So to kind of put it in context of this study, he basically is stipulating that Jesus became both the adulterer and the adulteress so that we might be made free from the law. Why? Precisely because we were married to another before Christ came. And by applying Jesus's death as a representative of us in the world, God has in effect ended our previous life, thereby making us new creations and qualifying us under a new covenant with the risen Christ.
Can you help me?
Listen, I'm not gonna lie. Listen, I'm not gonna lie. I just cried. Like I'm not joking. Like I cried, but then I got a text from Ab, and he said, "Bro, I just cried."
Can I ask a question real quick, Stan?
Yes.
Yeah, me
Yes,
next.
go for it, go
Because
for it.
something just came to mind. So is that the reason why when a marriage is consummated, there's a shedding of blood?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. Every time when that's why the whole thing about the virginity in marriage, that when they consummate the relationship, that there's a shedding of blood, it's because that covenant is being sealed. As a matter of fact, there are people in various cultures, whether in Europe or even in the Middle East, that they expect the bloody sheets to be hanging out from the windows on the marriage night.
Yes, yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm telling you right now that this thing about us being in a new covenant, it is the only covenant left. God has no plan. He has no other plan. This is it. That's why this thing that we have right now in Christ is so wonderful, because it makes it possible for Israel to be reconciled back to God. It cannot be reconciled back to God outside of Messiah. And it levels the playing field. It puts Israel and the rest of the nations in the same playing field. It levels them out. Where did we hear that?
I'm thinking of Jesus talking to the woman at the well when he's like, it doesn't matter what mountain you're going to be on. It doesn't matter, the Samaritans or like, you're thinking too small. You're thinking like Jerusalem has to be a place where you worship. And he's like, one day that's not even going to be a thing.
Yeah. And look, that's why this thing about understanding divorce and remarriage, I was handling, understanding how that the Old Testament's language specific and the New Testament and how Jesus was appropriating it. Understand that Jesus has all of these verses in mind. All of these Old Testament passages, he knows. He knows what's at stake, because this is about bringing about a marriage between the Son and his church. The Father divorced Israel and Israel remarried. He can't take her back. But we're not talking about a human being here. We're talking about somebody who has an unlimited array of expression of how he wants to convey his will. And so that through his Son, he can reconcile Israel back to himself without being in a covenant with Israel. And because he won't break his own law, he's not going to violate it. So that is.
Wait. Question. Because it's like confusion is trying to creep in for some strange reason. So we've got Israel needs to be reconciled because they've married another. So there has to be death. Now, the death of the husband, but Jesus died in order to Israel and the world. So I'm thinking like, so Jesus went as a representation of the Jews and the Gentiles. Like, how? Explain that part to me. How both of it You know, because
Yeah,
we do
because-
have some that say Jesus only died for the Jews.
No. So,
Like the Hebrew
so
Israelites.
let me explain. So the Israelites were always intended to be a royal priesthood. The law of Moses says that. They were intended to be a nation of priests among other nations. Okay. But they failed in their attempt. And when Jesus comes, every aspect of Jesus's life was a direct reflection of what Israel was supposed to do. Israel was in Egypt for 400 something years, right? And then they got out of Egypt and wandered in the wilderness for 40 days. Jesus, when he was born, went down into Egypt. And then after so many years, he came back. And then later on, he's in the desert for 40 days. You look at Jesus's life, and it's like it's transposed. It's like as if Jesus, everywhere Israel failed, Jesus succeeded. Every place that he went to, he did it as a perfect representative of the nation. Because remember, this covenant that we read in Jeremiah 31, it says that God was making a new covenant with who?
Israel.
Yeah, it says the house of Israel and the house of Judah, right? He makes the covenant with them, but there's no record of God getting together with the nation the way he did in the old covenant. The only record there is when the Messiah, the representative of the nation of Israel, comes. And as the Messiah, he is not only the representative of the nation in this covenant between God and Israel, he is also the covenant. There's a verse that says that God gave him to be a covenant of the people. Not only that, he is also the priest that offers the sacrifice for the covenant. But not only that, he is also the sacrifice that is offered. Everything about Jesus's work begins and ends with him.
This is
So
this
it
is
sounds
incredible.
completely, it's like mind-bogglingly dumb to go to another God right now. Like if you have no,
Yeah.
wow. Okay.
It's interesting because what I'm seeing is that, Israel, they broke the covenant so many times. They failed in so many places. Of course, God never failed, right? But they failed constantly. And God said, you know what? I have to make it so there's a way that they don't fail again. That way our relationship can never be tainted. And he does that by making a covenant with the Messiah, which is, an aspect of himself. And the Messiah is the covenant, and the Messiah is the one who initiates the covenant. It's really God making a covenant with himself, but doing it so that way it can be applied to all of humanity.
Through Jesus Christ, he had a human representative of the entire human race who lived under the law of Moses. And when he died, he became free from the law. But when he arose from the dead, he arose as something else. Because he is the representation of the whole human race, the whole human race died. Do you understand? And now, because he rose from the dead, a new creation has arisen. So that all those who believe in him become new creations. They become something else. And we become risen with him in the faith and operation of God. So it isn't that, he did die for Israel, but he died for Israel to get to the whole world. He had to make the reconciliation universal for all.
Dan, I was thinking, this helps me to understand forgiveness on another level as well. Jesus told him, to forgive 7 times 70, and just God creating a way for us to be with him. It's just amazing. It really, I'm sitting here and forgiveness is just being revealed to me in a whole nother way.
It is.
It's beautiful, man.
Well,
It's
and
beautiful.
to build on what Tawanda just said, especially when it's great that we focused on that parable about the steward, because that's exactly what it is. The Lord was always faithful. It was the steward that kept on messing up, but the Lord was just like, no, this is what's going to happen. Like this, you're still going to be forgiven.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
It's like he
I'm
said, I'm committed to
think,
forgiving you. That's deep.
uh, I'm thinking on the concept of, I know that I'm not one of the God is in control type doctrines, because that kind of takes the responsibility off of you. But when you think about how far ahead God is with his plans, like, not only is the devil trying his best to mess things up from Genesis on down, everything was so on schedule for God to forgive everybody, in spite of all Israel messing up, in spite of the devil coming in there, in spite of, watchers or anything like that. Anything that's thrown in there, God is like, yep, you're right on schedule. My forgiveness is going to happen. I'm like, that's he's like, when you're in chess, you're like, I'm 3 steps ahead of you. He's like 40 million steps ahead of you. Like, I'm this forgiveness is happening. This love is going to happen, and it just,
Man, it's so beautiful. The what I see out of it is just like God's love for people, like how much he wants to reconcile the world to himself, and how like it makes it, I think in with this study, like it's gonna make me read the Bible in a way that it's just like a love story in a sense. You know what I mean? Like this is God's, like God showing the world like his love.
Is
This
Jeremiah like
it's
the
just
notebook
so
where he just keeps on writing notes to her?
he just cries the whole time, Jeremiah,
Yep.
weeping prophet.
When you really
Keeps
think
writing
about
you.
it,
Keeps on asking you.
when you really think about it, God anticipated our human tendencies when he gave the law to Moses the way he did. Yeah, it's vague. There are certain things that he doesn't give explanations for. He gives 4 verses on divorce, but that's all he needed to say. See, God, we want to have like the whole shebang. We want to have like a whole list of stuff to make sense. God's like, I'm only going to say what I need to say because I know what's coming. He made it. He gave the law to Moses. It wasn't that specific about a lot of things. And it's fascinating that all of the things that he was not specific on is on everything that he hangs it on. Because he made it that way on purpose so that when the time came for him to execute his plan, it wouldn't be hindered by human choice. In fact, he factored in human choice into the whole thing. It is so profound how he anticipates human weakness. And his plan is not to reject humanity. It's to incorporate humanity into fellowship with him. He goes above and beyond our ability to comprehend. He doesn't have to manipulate anything. He just simply sets things into motion. And things happen the way they're supposed to, in the time that they're supposed to, that are intended to accomplish his will. And all the things that don't go the way they're supposed to, he factors that in at the same time. He's like, my plan will be perfect. My plan will not be denied. Even though all the powers of the dark work their way to try to get man to not know the true God, God's going to say, no. He says, you guys think I know. It's like he says, you guys think and plan, do all this stuff. I already know. I know every possible plan that you will never conceive of. You know, God doesn't have to think about this stuff. He knows this stuff. You know, so there's this, and because of that, he also knows every possibility as though it's a reality to him. Every possibility that we don't exercise is a reality to him. And he can incorporate everything to work together for good to those who love God. Not to everyone else, but to those who love God. Anyway, so that's the end of the study. I am up for questions. If anybody has any more questions or anything,
When's the next study? I'm sorry.
the next study is going to be the Godhead. We're going to pick up on the Godhead Bible study again.
Probably next
No,
next
no,
week or something, right?
no, we can, as a matter of fact, I was supposed to start working tomorrow, and I will go to work tomorrow night, but I'll be off Wednesday and Thursday. So if you guys wanna do it on Wednesday and Thursday, I can do that too. Like this week.
We'll put it in the chat and see whoever's available as well, to see if Jamal, you can also, like, you're in our chat, so you can message everybody that's in your chat as well.
I know on
Yeah, I'll let everybody.
Wednesday I do a training at 8:30 with the group, but Thursday is free for me.
All right, Thursday's good for me too.
We'll chat and we'll see if Thursday works for everybody.
All right, that sounds good. Any other questions?
I got a funny. Well,
By the way,
not a
how was the mic drop moment?
I got it. I caught the mic when it hit the floor because I was already laying on the floor to catch it.
It was like explosions happening every other verse.
But real talk, the first mic drop, I thought it was like the third or fourth one.
It is.
Hey, can you post that link one more time for the first divorce study?
Yeah, I'll put it in
Pretty
the
please.
Where is that?
It's just amazing to me that like you have all of these things interwoven into the word, and we're arguing over whether a woman should get married again after she divorces. You know, like it's just like you just missed the whole point. Like, you know, well, I'm saying you, like I didn't miss the whole point, you know, but I'm like, not to say that I get into those arguments anymore, but it's just they happen. And we're condemning people for getting remarried. And I'm like, I don't think we're getting the point of this thing. Like, if you would, here, let me send you a link to a Zoom meeting. You know what I mean? Like, it's just,
You know, I often wondered, I was like, why is it that I hear people saying that divorce is a sin when the law of Moses actually makes provision for it? And I remember I asked a pastor that one time, and the pastor said to me, he said, well, you know, that's just how that was under the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, it's you know, and God did say that he hates divorce. That's how it was always conveyed to me. And Jesus said, you know, that whoever marries a woman who's divorced commits adultery. And so therefore they can't, you know, if a person gets divorced, it's just, you know, bad all the way around. That's how it was described to me. And I was like, it doesn't answer the question. Why is everyone saying that it's a sin when, according to the New Testament, sin is the transgression of the law? So how can divorce be a sin if the law of Moses makes a provision for it? And then a lot of times I get silence. I don't get any response back. So I have to say, I will give credit to whom credit is due. Don Blizzard he's a friend of mine, and he did a study on divorce and remarriage one day because he was affiliated with the Reformation, the last Reformation, I think is what it was called. And he ended up leaving their group for doctrinal differences, among which was this issue about divorce, because the guys from the last Reformation were saying that if you've been divorced and you remarried, you're in sin. And so you need to go back to you need to divorce your current spouse and go back to your other spouse. And it was just causing a total upheaval. And he's like, no, you're not supposed to be doing that. And so he broke, he split ways, and he made a video about it. And he actually goes into it, and it's really good. If you can find a video on it by Don Blizzard, he does go a little more in depth into it. It's there's a lot of practical applications to this study that we haven't really touched on, like there are questions that you should ask, because the thing is that the passage is vague. It doesn't give that much detail, but unless you incorporate everything else that's happening, you're kind of like left to kind of interpret a lot for yourself. And in today's world, especially where honestly we have, I think, divorce in the church is a plague. It's just as bad in the church as it is in the world. And we have to ask, a lot of times, like people who are very staunch defenders of staying married, it's actually done a lot more harm than good in many cases. And this is in no way, I need to say this because this is being recorded, okay? This does not validate a person's desire to get divorced just because they're tired of being with the person, okay? If anything, if we look at God's example, even though Israel was committing adultery, God was still wanting to get her back. Now think about that. Think about all of the work and the labor that God did to have Israel come back to him and to forgive and to show mercy and to be patient with Israel. And Israel was an unfaithful spouse. The only example that we have for divorce is in the Bible is God's divorcement of Israel. And that's after he had done everything possible to fight for his marriage with Israel. Everything that he did. And so we can't look at divorce as something light. Like we can't just say that it's something that can be disregarded, something that, oh yeah, you know what, we're just not, no. In the New Testament, there's things in the New Testament that Paul's like, okay, well, if you look at the words that Paul uses in the New Testament, you as a believer, let's say you're married to an unbeliever, okay? When you're married to an unbeliever, the Bible, Paul, the way he words it, it very clearly stipulates that the decision to leave is not yours. The decision to leave is the unbeliever. Because now I want you to think, when Paul talks about people, for example, who are married to an unbeliever, right? He says, if the unbelieving desires to depart, let them depart. And the person, because that means that they just want a divorce and they want to, end the marriage. He says, let them go. And then the person can remarry again, but only in the Lord. Okay. We're not talking about putting away. We're talking about actual divorce ending because of theological differences, things of that nature. Okay. But to the believer, he says, let not this person put anybody away. You're not allowed to put anybody away. He says you can't, and the decision to leave has to be on the person who is an unbeliever, not the believer, because you as the believer, you're responsible to make every effort to make it work, just like God was with Israel.
Hello.
And you also have to ask other questions. I just want to finish up one thought also. There's some questions that you need to ask also, okay? Because there are situations because in this situation with Paul, as is in the situation with the Torah in Deuteronomy, it's not an exhaustive text. In other words, it doesn't cover every situation. It just offers an ideal situation. There are situations where it becomes necessary to divorce. You have to ask yourself, what if remaining in a marriage poses a danger to the spouse or the children? right? What if the spouse has been consistently demonstrating infidelity, right? Or if they did it once, should the terms of a marriage be clearly spelled out before a marriage even takes place, right? Aren't there expectations that should be established that if violated should justify divorce? I mean, is the offended person willing to forgive an offense on a continual basis? Or should there be a particular limit to a kind of offense, certain kind of offense? Look, another question you should ask yourself is, what would God do if he were in my shoes? How does Jesus handle our infidelity today? Is it wrong to stay in a marriage that's dead, or is it right to leave a marriage that's working? And the answer to both of these two questions aren't necessarily the same, right? Can certain actions, which if imposed, cause a continual violation of the conscience of a spouse, would that be a reasonable means for justifying divorce? It's like, such as, like, for example, physical abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, or even spiritual abuse. I know a bunch of women in the Middle East who they're Christians and they're sold into slavery. They're forced to marry a Muslim who is constantly pressuring them to forsake Christianity, to forsake Christ, and to follow Allah, right? Is remarriage even an option? And if so, what would you do different? And what is stopping you from doing it now? These are all questions that we need to ask. These are things that we have to kind of cultivate in our dialogue. We have to recognize that there are situations where there is a legitimate reason for divorce, and there are situations in which there are not legitimate reasons, and we need to be able to discuss that. There are situations in which a divorce is necessary, and other in which a divorce is not an option. But people think that that's just, oh, I'll just get it. I've heard people talk and say, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll just get a divorce. Like it's like a, whatever, like change a coffee cup or something, We need to think about this. We need to treat marriage the way God does. What God has put together, let no man separate. Anyway, what was I think it was a Royal Ninja or Ninja, whatever. You wanted to make a comment earlier?
It's Royal Niger.
Yeah.
But okay, so I was married to an unbeliever, and I fought for that marriage.
Okay.
Regardless of everything he did to me, I fought for the marriage. But it got to a point where I was like, okay, now I'm at a place where it's whatever he want to do. So he ended up divorcing me, and I was not mad.
You're free to marry another, but only in the Lord.
Amen. And other people, I used to always ask this question. I used to go to people and ask them, can I marry again? And they used to tell me, no, if you was married before, you have to go back to your husband. And I'm like, but he was an unbeliever. He didn't treat me well.
Nope.
And I was just so frustrated. Like, this cannot be, So
it's not correct. You because you have your husband decided to divorce you, even though you fought for your marriage, you did everything you could. He is the one who initiated everything. You are the textbook example of somebody who can freely remarry.
Thank you. Now, a woman broke this down before the way in a different way, but she said the same thing you said. So this is the second time I've actually heard this, and it makes sense because everybody that told me I can't remarry, they don't have nothing to show me. They just telling me, God hates divorce. That's it.
Yeah, that and again, that verse, I don't know if you heard it when I said it in the study earlier, but that verse that says, do you know where that verse that says God hates divorce?
I don't know where it is exactly, but I ran across it a few times.
Hold on a second, I'll show it to you.
Stan, didn't you say earlier it translates God hates the putting away?
Yeah.
It's the same one, right?
Yeah.
Is it Malachi 2:16?
So it's Malachi 2:16. So it says, for the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away. For one covereth violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed to your spirit that you deal not treacherously. And he's specifically talking about the people who dealt treacherously with the wives. So the putting away, this verse in Hebrew is not referring to God hates divorce. It says that he hates putting away. That is, men who have a legitimate marriage and they're putting their wives away in an illegitimate way. God does not approve of that, because the law says, even, the law is very specific. The man has to write the bill of divorcement in writing. He has to write it by hand. He has to hand it to her, and then he puts her away. He sends her out of the house. So God hates it when a man does that without giving her a writing of divorcement, because if he does that, in Semitic culture in the ancient world, if a woman was put away, it was typically because she was viewed as a bad wife, as an immoral person. And the reasons for putting anybody away was because of an immoral act. So if a man put away his wife and she had done no wrong, but let's say he decided to put her away because he was just a vile person and he just didn't care for his wife, and he decided to put her away, he can do that to justify keeping her dowry, because every time she married, she would bring a dowry into the home. And so by not divorcing her, he could, by putting her away, he could keep her dowry. That's her money that her parents, bequeathed to her. And then he can basically force her into a desolate lifestyle where she would be forced to do prostitution or something, because no man would marry a woman who was put away. So she would basically become destitute. That's why many women who are put away in the Old Testament, and in the last study that I did, there was, and again, you have the link in the chat, there was a considerable amount of injustice done to women. So that by the time you get to Jesus, when he starts addressing all of the issues with regards to divorce and remarriage, he levels the playing field by bringing men down and women up so that they're leveled. And he basically imposes the same restrictions on both men and women, making them equal.
Amen.
Any other questions?
Well, guys, I'm gonna get out. I have to get ready to put my daughter to bed. This was awesome. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Anytime. All right. Well, I don't know if you guys want to stop the recording. We're good to go.